Good Saturday morning to you. It is Peter Alexander here from Studio 1A in New York. It is 5 o'clock on the East Coast, and we again are following this breaking news developing in Iran and throughout the Middle East region. A few hours ago, the United States launching what the president is calling major combat operations in Iran, striking multiple targets in coordination with Israel. Explosions could be heard in Tehran earlier. Smoke was seen billowing throughout the capital city there. Iran has vowed to retaliate, and already there are other explosions that have been heard throughout the region. Israeli residents are being told to shelter in place in preparation for possible retaliation. The president a short time ago released a video statement on Truth Social shortly after the operation began. We are going to play that for you now as we continue our live breaking news coverage.
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people. Its menacing activities directly endanger the United States, our troops, our bases overseas, and our allies throughout the world. For 47 years, the Iranian regime has chanted death to America and waged an unending campaign of bloodshed and mass murder, targeting the United States, our troops, and the innocent people in many, many countries. Among the regime's very first acts was to back a violent takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding dozens of American hostages for 444 days. In 1983, Iran's proxies carried out the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut that killed 241 American military personnel. In 2000, they knew and were probably involved with the attack on the USS Cole. Many died. Iranian forces killed and maimed hundreds of American service members in Iraq. The regime's proxies have continued to launch countless attacks against American forces stationed in the Middle East in recent years, as well as U.S. naval and commercial vessels and international shipping lanes. It's been mass terror, and we're not going to put up with it any longer. From Lebanon to Yemen and Syria to Iraq, the regime has armed, trained, and funded terrorist militias that have soaked the earth with blood and guts. And it was Iran's proxy, Hamas, that launched the monstrous October 7th attacks on Israel, slaughtering more than 1,000 innocent people, including 46 Americans, while taking 12 of our citizens hostage. It was brutal, something like the world has never seen before. Iran is the world's #1 state sponsor of terror and just recently killed tens of thousands of its own citizens on the street as they protested. It has always been the policy of the United States, in particular, my administration, that this terrorist regime can never have a nuclear weapon. I'll say it again. They can never have a nuclear weapon. That is why in Operation Midnight Hammer last June, we obliterated the regime's nuclear program at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. After that attack, we warned them never to resume their malicious pursuit of nuclear weapons, and we sought repeatedly to make a deal. We tried. They wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. Again, they wanted to do it. They didn't want to do it. They didn't know what was happening. They just wanted to practice evil. But Iran refused, just as it has for decades and decades. They've rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions, and we can't take it anymore. Instead, they attempted to rebuild their nuclear program and to continue developing long-range missiles that can now threaten our very good friends and allies in Europe, our troops stationed overseas, and could soon reach the American homeland. Just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. For these reasons, the United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests. We are going to destroy their missiles and raise their missile industry to the ground. It will be totally, again, obliterated. We're going to annihilate their Navy. We're going to ensure that the region's terrorist proxies can no longer destabilize the region or the world and attack our forces and no longer use their IEDs or roadside bombs, as they are sometimes called, to so gravely wound and kill thousands and thousands of people, including many Americans. And we will ensure that Iran does not obtain a nuclear weapon. It's a very simple message. They will never have a nuclear weapon. This regime will soon learn that no one should challenge the strength and might of the United States Armed Forces. I built and rebuilt our military in my first administration, and there is no military on earth even close to its power, strength, or sophistication. My administration has taken every possible step to minimize the risk to U.S. personnel in the region. Even so, and I do not make this statement lightly, the Iranian regime seeks to kill. The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. But we're doing this not for now. We're doing this for the future, and it is a noble mission. We pray for every service member as they selflessly risk their lives to ensure that Americans and our children will never be threatened by a nuclear-armed Iran. We ask God to protect all of our heroes in harm's way, and we trust that, with his help, the men and women of the armed forces will prevail. We have the greatest in the world, and they will prevail. To the members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the armed forces, and all of the police, I say tonight that you must lay down your weapons and have complete immunity, or, in the alternative, face certain death. So, lay down your arms. You will be treated fairly with total immunity, or you will face certain death. Finally, to the great, proud people of Iran, I say tonight that the hour of your freedom is at hand. Stay sheltered. Don't leave your home. It's very dangerous outside. Bombs will be dropping everywhere. When we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. For many years, you have asked for America's help, but you never got it. No president was willing to do what I am willing to do tonight. Now you have a president who is giving you what you want. So let's see how you respond. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force. Now is the time to seize control of your destiny and to unleash the prosperous and glorious future that is close within your reach. This is the moment for action. Do not let it pass. May God bless the brave men and women of America's armed forces. May God bless the United States of America. May God bless you all. Thank you.
You've been listening to President Donald Trump a short time ago in a recorded statement posted on his Truth Social account overnight, again detailing the U.S.-Israeli military operations targeting Iran that began within the last several hours. Among the comments he said, as we show you some of the video from that region right now, he made very clear that his intentions were to, quote, devastate Iran's military, to eliminate its nuclear program, and ultimately to bring about change in the Iranian government. In the lead up to this, with that region on edge, the president, only a matter of hours ago before departing the White House for his Mar-a-Lago property, had said that he was in effect not happy, dissatisfied still with Iran's handling of the U.S.'s desire for it to back away from its nuclear program. But it had remained an unanswered question exactly what the intended result was from U.S. military strikes. Were they to happen? The president here making clear that the desire is to complete many things at once. Again, regime change, to remove its ability to produce nuclear weapons, and ultimately to destroy its military. Specifically, he refers to its Navy. He says to the people of Iran, if they hear his message, in their effort to rise up, he says, it will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. We do have team coverage from around the globe, from here in the United States to the region. I want to begin with our senior national security correspondent, Courtney Kube. You can see my colleagues there as well, Keir Simmons, Richard Engel, and others. Courtney, let's start with this, if we can, with some of the details about what we know is taking place. It's worth taking a step back and realizing that the president, in effect, in this statement is making his case for war, even after he has now already declared war, as he notes there, without any congressional authorization right now. This is a very wide scope, and as we are reporting, the president is going much further than those initial strikes that took place in June of 2025, targeting just the nuclear program. Now it appears to be a much wider motivation that has led this effort by the United States and Israel.
Yeah, and we haven't really heard a whole lot of justification for these strikes and the threat that the president in that video called imminent tonight made to the American people. As you mentioned, he has laid out a very broad and somewhat lofty set of ambitions for what he wants to accomplish with these strikes. And that is, as he said, to annihilate the Iranian Navy, to end their ballistic missile program, which is pretty advanced and extensive, to also ensure they never get a nuclear weapon. But then he also talked about the Iranian people taking advantage of this U.S. military and Israeli military action for potential regime change, calling this their moment and saying that this is really the only time they may have for a generation to be able to carry out this sort of possible regime change. So again, very lofty goals here. And what that suggests is not a quick action, as we saw back in June, but a potentially sustained and ongoing campaign if, in fact, the United States hopes to accomplish those objectives. Now, we know the initial set of strikes by the U.S. military is targeting military and security facilities in Iran of the Iranian regime. The U.S. is using both airstrikes and naval assets, including Tomahawk missiles. Those are very targeted, longer-range missiles that give a little bit of standoff distance for the United States military, for those Navy assets. That means that they can fire them from a little bit further away, gives them a little bit more time if Iran were to retaliate directly from the source of those Tomahawks. But, Peter, we still don't have a really good sense of exactly what the United States has hit so far, and exactly whether this is the first wave and when, if this is going to be like continuing for hours and hours and hours, if we're going to see waves over days. These are the kinds of questions we're still asking. And then very, very critically, we have already begun to see retaliation from Iran. So far, we've heard from at least 5 different nations in the region saying that they have intercepted or shot down incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. That includes Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. It includes Qatar and Kuwait. Now, one thing not only that those countries have in common, of course, that they're right there in the region close to Iran, but they all are home to U.S. military forces and in some cases U.S. military bases. We know that that Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, that is the U.S.'s largest air base in the region, about 10,000 men and women there at any given time. The majority of those people were taken off the base in recent hours. We've seen that happen before. That is generally done because of concerns about a potential base there, or excuse me, a potential attack there. We have seen Iran attack Al Udeid before. They did so after Operation Midnight Hammer back in June. So again, the questions that we still have out there are not only what did the United States hit, but we know that some of the retaliation has already been intercepted, but have any of those missiles actually been successful in striking U.S. military bases, U.S. military installations in the region. At least one missile appears to have gotten through in Bahrain. That is where the headquarters of the U.S. Navy in the region is, U.S. Fifth Fleet. It is an enormous installation there with thousands of U.S. military personnel, and very critically, that is one of the rare accompanied tours for the U.S. military in the region. That means the men and women who are assigned there are allowed to bring their families. They often live very close to the base. Again, we're working to see about any kind of battle damage assessment about damage to the installations, but also any potential casualties here, Peter.
Courtney, I want you to stay with us for a second as we have this conversation. Again, looking at some of the images we're getting from that region right now. One thing that was striking in the president's remarks in that pre-recorded statement earlier is that he said about American forces, Americans in that region, he said, quote, we may have casualties, which is notable. He said that, in his words, often happens in war, acknowledging that this is war that the U.S. is now mired in right now, acknowledging the potential risk to Americans in that region. I want to get a better understanding of what our forces are throughout that area. We have witnessed and been reporting over the course of the last several months the buildup there, the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, among others. How broad is the U.S. force presence in that region? And can you give us a sense of, it appears clear this is going to go on for quite some time. What potential exists for the U.S. to sustain an operation like this?
So what's really critical about what the U.S. has brought into the region, there were already about 35 to 40,000 men and women in the region before all this buildup began. But it's not really just about the numbers of what the U.S. has brought in. It's really the capabilities. So advanced air defenses and advanced air systems like the F-22 fighter. The U.S. brought in about a dozen of those to a base known as Avda in southern Israel. Those have the ability to do air defense suppression, so they can stop Iranian air defenses that would be able to potentially shoot down aircraft that are moving in to conduct airstrikes. That's really important. It basically creates a path, a clearer path for manned fighters to move in and conduct airstrikes. The U.S. has brought in F-35s on the USS Gerald R. Ford. That's now in the Eastern Med. Again, an advanced stealth fighter. But also critically, I mean, look, logistics wins wars, right? So they have brought in dozens of tankers, cargo aircraft, the kinds of things that you need for a potentially sustained air campaign. Because it's not just about getting those fighter aircraft in. It's also about keeping them in the air with simple things like giving them the fuel that they're going to need. They've also brought in additional munitions. We know that the ships there have extensive air defense systems. We know that the ships there, they've brought in additional ships. So we now have about 5 different destroyers in the Mediterranean. There's a number of different destroyers in the northern Arabian Sea, so up towards the Strait of Hormuz. There's the 2 aircraft carriers with their extensive aircraft capabilities. So when you talk about just the firepower that exists there, it's overwhelming, and it's enough that the U.S. could sustain a weeks-long offensive campaign. But then there's the defensive piece, and that is really, really important here, as we've already seen as Iran begins to retaliate. Part of those assets also provide a defensive capability. So when you're talking about the destroyers there, they have a ballistic missile defense capability. That means that they can fire up a missile off the ship that will intercept an incoming missile. The F-22s that I mentioned in southern Israel, they have in the past been able to have an air-to-air defensive capability. What that means is they put them up in the air and they can shoot down an incoming drone or cruise missile. We've seen them do it before. So this has been it's been a large array of assets and weapons that have been brought in, but they provide both the offensive and the defensive capability. Now, all of that being said, what exists there right now as is not enough for a months-long campaign. The goals that the president laid out here are not going to be achieved quickly unless Iran were to decide to completely capitulate. I mean, look, we have no idea what's going to happen over the coming days and weeks, but if in fact this were to be a longer sustained campaign, they would absolutely have to bring in additional capabilities. I would suspect that the USS George H.W. Bush, it's off the coast of Norfolk. It's a couple of weeks away from really being ready to deploy. They could bring that in with all of its associated ships and additional assets and squadrons. But Peter, at this point, what they have there right now is enough for a days or even a couple of weeks of a sustained campaign for both offensive and defensive.
National security correspondents here at NBC News. For those who are just waking up just shy of 5:20 Eastern time right now, we are reporting U.S. and Israeli airstrikes targeting a series of targets throughout Iran, specifically in Tehran there, as the president of the United States, Donald Trump, has made clear this is part of a new operation, he says, focused on devastating the country's military, eliminating its nuclear program, and ultimately the president indicates an opportunity for the people of Iran to try to overtake the existing regime in that country. We are hearing now from some of the president's allies, even at this early hour. The Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, one of those closest to Donald Trump, who has been very hawkish in his desires to target Iran for many years, posting a short time ago, "As I watch and monitor this historic operation, I'm in awe of President Trump's determination to be a man of peace, but at the end of the day, evil's worst nightmare." He goes on to say, "Well done, Mr. President." The political debate will wait right now. We want to focus on the specifics on the ground. That includes the reporting of our colleague, NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Richard, not long ago, you were in Tehran there, as that country, that region, frankly, has been on edge for weeks and months right now. Give us a better understanding of what you're hearing. We know there is, in effect, an internet blackout, which makes it very difficult to get specific answers to questions in terms of what was targeted and what the targets will be going forward. But what more are we learning as we speak?
So the internet blackout in Iran is not total at this stage. I have managed to speak to some people in Iran, civilians, and a government official. I spoke to a government official, or exchanged a message, I should say, with a government official just a short while ago. And he described this as now war, open war. I asked about negotiations. The official said that, in his opinion, the negotiations with the U.S. were never genuine. They were never real. It was all a trick, that the U.S. and Israel were planning to do this all along. This is now a regional conflict. We don't know how far it's going to escalate, but just in the last several hours, it has gone from preemptive U.S. And Israeli strikes against targets in multiple locations all across Iran to a regional conflict, because according to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Iran fired back in retaliation with simultaneous missile attacks against those same countries that Courtney just listed: Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. All of those countries have confirmed that they were attacked by Iranian ballistic missiles, and they all confirmed that their missile defense systems were activated and shot down those incoming attacks. Also, Jordan, which wasn't specifically mentioned by Iran as a target, as a country that it had targeted, has also said that it knocked down ballistic missiles that were targeting Jordanian territory. So we are seeing a expanding regional war, and to put it into a broader context, Israel, which has also been attacked. I'm here in Tel Aviv, and we've heard air raid sirens. I was woken up this morning by an air raid siren. We've seen some of the Israeli missile defense systems in action over the skies above Tel Aviv. Also, Israeli defense systems activated near Jerusalem as well. There is now conflict from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to India, because let's not forget that Afghanistan and Pakistan just announced an open war against each other. So we have a zone of chaos, a zone of conflict covering a large part of the world. And when you listen to what President Trump said his objectives are, and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel also put out a statement calling on the Iranian people to rise up, describing this as a long-term campaign, a devastating campaign. President Trump Trump and Israel's objective has been made quite clear. They want to bomb Iran from afar with as much force as necessary to weaken the government to a point where the Iranian people rise up and overthrow the government. That is very risky. It is not clear at all that it will be successful because Courtney described all of the military assets that have been brought in, all the naval power, all the air power. But what has not been brought in this time are tanks. What has not been brought in are ground troops. This is the biggest military buildup since 2003 when the U.S. invaded Iraq. But when that happened, the U.S. brought in an invasion force to take over Iraq, oversee the transition to a new government, an occupation government, and then ultimately a new Iraqi government under U.S. supervision. This time, a totally different strategy. The strategy is to pound Iran so hard to take away its proxies, which are spread out all across the region, to take away its missile program, to eliminate its navy, to disarm Iran, to declaw Iran to a point where the Iranian people can rise up and finish the job. That is a very unpredictable scenario. It is not clear that the Iranian people have that ability to rise up and take on a government, even one that is in this process right now of being dismantled from the air and sea.
Richard Engel, our chief foreign correspondent, is joining us from the ground in Tel Aviv right now. Richard, we're going to allow you to try to make some more calls to those you've been speaking to in Iran. We're going to get back to you in a moment as you've been speaking about the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. We have also heard from him in the form of a statement where, to Richard's point, he does call on the people of Iran to rise up, saying, in part, he says this murderous terrorist regime must not be allowed to arm itself with nuclear weapons that would enable it to threaten all of humanity. He says our joint action will create the conditions for the brave Iranian people to take their destiny into their own hands. So it appears very clear that we are at the beginning of what is, at least in the eyes of both the U.S. and Israeli governments, an extended operation that ultimately will require the buy-in from both many countries throughout that region, but certainly the people of Iran to try to rise up and overtake the Iranian regime. I want to get to NBC's chief international correspondent, Keir Simmons. He is joining me from Dubai right now. And Keir, I was up early listening to some of your coverage right now. You make an important point, excuse me, about that region. The Strait of Hormuz there is really one of the chokeholds as we talk about the potential early impacts on the United States as it relates to the free flow of oil throughout that region. I think it's almost 20% of the world's oil travels through that small area, 21 miles wide, as the graphic shows those waking up with us right now. Can you talk a bit about some of the ripple effects right now, including the fact that there are shelter-in-place orders existing at embassies in where? Jordan, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and that Bahrain has seen explosions in its country as well.
Yeah, and we should keep eyes on the Strait of Hormuz, Peter, because the Iranians were carrying out naval exercises there and even at one point closed it for a brief time during this past week. But I want to just get to some breaking news for our viewers. From here in the UAE, I think the first report of someone killed as a result of this Iranian response, missiles and drones. I'm looking down, Peter, just to look at the statement that I have from the UAE Ministry of Defense. I'm here in Dubai, as you say, Abu Dhabi is the capital. I've heard from now myself multiple witnesses who have heard explosions around both of these cities. That there are military bases close to both of these cities. Let me just get to that news, though, of someone killed. The UAE Ministry of Defense says that, and this may explain the explosions, says that it announces a successful interception of several Iranian missiles targeting the country. And then it goes on to say the relevant authorities in the country also dealt with debris falling on a residential area in Abu Dhabi, resulting in some material damage and the death of an Asian national. Now, I've spoken to someone who's in Abu Dhabi today. They describe hearing 3 extremely loud, as they describe it, pops overhead, and think pops which they believed were 3 missile interception bursts. That there is a base a UAE base near Abu Dhabi, Al Afra. US forces are based there. In every one of these countries, these bases have US forces. Again, just looking down, we do know from the Iranians that they have said that they have targeted here in the UAE and talked about bases in the UAE, as well as in Qatar, in Kuwait, and in Bahrain. So in Bahrain, they put out a message saying there was an imminent missile drone attack in Bahrain. Bahrain is a short distance from here. It is the home of the US Fifth Fleet. It is where the USS Lincoln ported for a short time just in recent weeks before it headed to the Arabian Sea, and is very likely now that aircraft carrier taking part in these attacks. Bahrain telling its people in Manama, the capital, and across that country, as a precaution, keep a safe room in home. It should be accessible, located on the ground floor. You know, Bahrain is a relatively sleepy place, aside from the military bases that are there. People, you know, I know people there. People will be stunned, shocked to be getting that message that they may need to shelter in place. And there are those reports that missiles have struck, or that there have been explosions. The difficulty here is that those explosions can be the air defences, Patriot, for example, Patriot air defences protecting these bases, or it can be contact, and we don't know right now. The Qataris, just to that point, are saying now that they, and this is their words, successfully thwarted a number of attacks targeting the country's territory. And then just to Kuwait, they are talking about ongoing efforts to protect the airspace of the state of Kuwait. And I just want Peter to get to some of these statements from these countries where I am, and they go to the point that Richard Engel was making about the potential for escalation with all of this. So the UAE Ministry of Defence, for example, says such acts constitute a dangerous escalation and cowardly act that threatens the security and safety of civilians and undermines stability, and a blatant violation of national sovereignty and international law, the Defence Ministry here says. And then it goes on to say the state reserves the full right to respond to this escalation and take all necessary measures to protect its territory, its people and its residents. So there you have, and we also have a similar message from Bahrain. There you have these Gulf countries saying that they reserve the right to respond to these attacks by the Iranians. I'll just tell you one other point, Peter. There have been some reports around of possible explosions in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. I have contacted someone there. They say they haven't heard anything. So it may be that that's just kind of false reporting. In this, what you could describe as the fog of war, there will be a lot that we hear about that then turns out to not be the case. But this is what these governments have feared might happen, that Iran, facing the Iranian regime, facing effectively what it would believe as an existential threat, would lash out across this region and try to make things so difficult for the Trump administration that it backs down, and for the Israelis. And that goes to your point about the Strait of Hormuz. We haven't heard yet whether the Iranians have attempted to block that strait. But again, that would have a material impact potentially, you've got to think, on oil prices. And I suspect that's why President Trump said in his statement, I think he used the words, I can't remember the word he used exactly, but he's talked about heavily targeting the Iranian Navy. And I suspect part of that is about attempting to get ahead of attempts to block the Strait of Hormuz.
Continue to do your reporting. We appreciate your joining us at this early hour here on the East Coast. I want to share some reporting again as you're waking up with NBC News special coverage of the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, and now some of the response from Iran beginning to take place as well. We're hearing from my colleagues, Courtney Kube, Gordon Lubold, two of our national security leading reporters, telling us so far in the military operation in Iran, Israel targeted Iranian leaders, while the United States targeted Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear programs. That reporting comes from two U.S. officials. Again, to be very clear, this is a coordinated effort by the United States and Israel, and it is now our reporting that the Israelis focused their targets on Iranian leadership, while the U.S. targeted Iran's ballistic missile and nuclear programs there. That's notable because you'll remember in June of 2025, the U.S., with those B-2 bombers, among others, had that stealth attack focusing Operation Midnight Hammer on the nuclear program that exists within Iran. I want to get back to Richard Engel, our chief foreign correspondent. Right now, Richard, obviously, we're in the early stages of this. This is clearly a much wider scope of the U.S. and Israeli strikes here. And as a result, we're also learning of some other attacks targeting American bases, including some in Iraq. What more have you learned?
So just while you were talking to Keir, there was another report, this time from Reuters, that an American military base in Iraq was also targeted in northern Iraq in the Kurdish areas. But before we get to that, you could probably hear right now that the air raid sirens are once again in action here in Tel Aviv. We will see if there are any interceptions, any impacts. This is the third or fourth time this morning that we have heard sirens like this. First, the way this works is first you get an alert on your phone telling you that something is incoming, giving you some distance. And then when they become quite close, you hear the air raid sirens themselves. And it's quite bright here, but you can see, or you might be able to see, these white trails in the sky going through the clouds. Those are Israeli missile interception systems fired up toward incoming fire. I have not heard them explode. Generally, when there are interceptions, you hear the explosion of the impact because these interceptor missiles are quite large. So what the Israelis are doing is they are firing missiles at missiles with the intention of destroying them in midair. They are very effective. And there you just heard right now the explosion of one of those interceptors. Often a danger is that the debris, because these missiles are blown up in midair, so there's the danger, obviously, of them impacting the ground, hurting, killing people. But then there is also the danger of the falling debris from both the missile and the interceptor itself landing in the city. Those two interceptions taking place right over the built-up area of Tel Aviv, right in the center of the city. Now hearing what sounds like the second interception. They took place quite at very high altitude. That's why that explains the delay. We can see the interceptors going up first, but you hear the actual explosion often a few seconds later. So Tel Aviv once again now defending itself from an Iranian attack after Israel and the United States began this campaign this morning, launching what they called a preemptive strike against Iran. And by all indications, we are very much in the early phases of this, Peter, with Iran responding by attacking U.S. military installations all across the region.
And Richard, as we listen to your live reporting there again on the ground in Tel Aviv, Israel right now, it's striking. Obviously, this is the early stages of an operation that the U.S. and Israelis have made clear is going to be sustained for quite some time. But in many ways, this does appear to be that type of regional conflict that many had feared for quite some time, where you're hearing from Bahrain that they are intercepting missiles targeting their country, perhaps U.S. bases there. We're hearing from Iraq right now that American military base there has been targeted. You're hearing the Israelis putting up interceptors. Iran is seeing a series of strikes, obviously, as they were the predicate for all of this, the United States and Israel targeting them. It raises the question, which is, how does this end? And while it's so early, clearly this does produce a situation where there's a sense of this sort of circular firing squad, where there are different rockets and missiles going in all different directions right now. The president's intention is that this ends with regime change in Iran. But Richard, you were in Iran not long ago. That is a very, very risky
It is a risky endeavor. It is also very difficult to accomplish without boots on the ground. And President Trump's objective, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's objective, is to topple the regime. They've said that openly. They're calling on Iranians to take matters into their own hands once the regime is weak enough and carry out regime change. That has a whole host of things that could go wrong. And when you look at how much of the world right now is embroiled in conflict, you have Israel, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Jordan, all of them talking today, just today, about receiving incoming Iranian fire or Israel and the United States firing at Iran. Combine that with the fact that Pakistan and India, Pakistan and Afghanistan just announced an open war with each other. So you have a war zone, a spreading war zone from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to India. That is roughly 3,000 miles of conflict zone, an area of the world that holds hundreds of millions of people. So the possibilities for this to be very long and with unintended consequences are very high.
Richard Engel is our chief foreign correspondent. He's on the ground in Tel Aviv right now. Again, you've heard sirens within the last few minutes. We heard explosions in the air, some of those missile interceptors there, looking to fend off any potential incoming in that region. I think our Meet the Press moderator, Kristen Welker, is with us as well. I'm hoping, Kristen, there you are. I appreciate your being up early to help us detail what we're witnessing here, Kristen. We've heard from some of the president's allies. We heard from the president himself. If we pull back a bit here and look at this from the political perspective, this is a president who has made very clear from the beginning his desire to end the threat, in his view, from Iran right now, a president who ran under the guise of focusing particularly on domestic issues, the topic of immigration and the economy, said that it was an America First policy. I trust that we will hear from those within the administration saying that this is America First because it focuses on the security of American forces in the region and Americans here at home, with the threat the president has said that Iran was, in his words, approaching the point where it could hit the United States right now. But it's also striking that these attacks, this war, as the president describes it, took place without congressional authorization. And really before today, no real detailed communication of what the motivation was, why there was a need for the United States to go to war in this form at this time.
Peter, I think you're exactly right, and that is where the conversation will go here in Washington. I can tell you I just spoke with one of the president's top allies, Senator Lindsey Graham, someone who has been very hawkish, calling for military action in Iran for quite some time. As you know, as you just reported, he said he anticipates that this military operation will last for days, if not weeks. He said the goal here is the elimination of the Ayatollah. The operation, he says, will be massive in scope, and its goal is the elimination of the Iranian regime. He just told the Wall Street Journal as well. He goes on to say it has been a dream of mine for so long that the Ayatollah's murderous regime will be replaced by the people who seek a better life for themselves and their country. The question is, how does that exactly happen? Can that be achieved through military power and through the Iranian people rising up themselves? It is widely thought that regime change in Iran far more complicated than in Venezuela, Peter, and that speaks to your point about this debate of congressional approval. The calls for congressional approval will grow louder in the coming hours, I can tell you. And also, I think the debate within the president's own party, does this fit within that America First vision? There are going to be some skeptics, some of the president's own supporters undoubtedly, who have some real concerns about this. Will this cost American lives, Peter?
You know, Kristen, it's striking as we watch what's taking place right now in that region. It was barely, not even 2 months ago, that the U.S. ultimately participated in the change of regime in Venezuela. I know you were there speaking to Delcy Rodriguez, who is the interim president in that country, the removal of Nicolas Maduro and what was that stunning American effort there that happened overnight was able to remove him, bring him back to the United States, where he is now facing justice. And now, less than 2 months later, the U.S. is looking to try to do the same thing in a much more complex region, not Venezuela, but in Iran, with an Ayatollah who has been in place there for decades here. This is going to raise some real challenges that I'm sure we're going to hear from American lawmakers, some of the president's fiercest critics, about what he views as a wide, sustained effort. And to the point of your conversation with Lindsey Graham, this isn't a matter of hours, but days and likely weeks, and ultimately could require boots on the ground in some form to help support an effort to overtake the Ayatollah, for there to be a complete regime change in that region. This is a much, much bigger effort than the one we witnessed only a matter of weeks ago.
And, Peter, we saw the debate play out in the weeks leading up to this. You heard Vice President J.D. Vance, for example, in an interview say, look, there's not going to be a prolonged military effort in the Middle East. And yet President Trump himself seemed to contradict that statement on Friday when he told reporters, basically, you can never guarantee that there won't be a prolonged military effort. That's everything that President Trump campaigned against, Peter, going all the way back to 2016, by the way. But to your point about congressional oversight, there's already a bipartisan bill that is being proposed that would require the administration to seek congressional approval before any sustained conflict in the Middle East. Is that something that more lawmakers will now support in the wake of these attacks against Iran that we are seeing play out now with the United States and Israel? Will the calls for congressional approval and, quite frankly, Peter, congressional oversight grow louder? I can tell you, based on my conversations with administration officials, they acknowledge just how complicated regime change will be. Now, look, they say, yes, you can do it without putting boots on the ground. But how exactly does that happen, Peter? What are the mechanics of that? Their hope, as you heard the president lay out, is that the Iranian people will rise up. But that is risky and challenging in and of itself.
Kristen Welker is the moderator of Meet the Press. She's going to have a full plate on Sunday as we hear from lawmakers, their immediate reactions to what we're witnessing excuse me, taking place right now. I should report, Kristen, while you were speaking, we're hearing from other colleagues right now that the Secretary of State, the president's national security advisor, Marco Rubio, gave individual members of what is called the Gang of Eight. Those are some of the leading members of Congress on both the Republican and Democratic sides. He gave members of the Gang of Eight and leadership a heads up about the operation. That heads up was given to them while the operation was underway. The staff, we are told, received notifications. I want to get to Jeremy Bash. He is a former chief of staff at the CIA, Pentagon as well, an NBC News contributor. Fortunately for us, on days like this, he has a breadth of knowledge about that region and some of the conversations that would be happening behind closed doors on a day like this. Jeremy, we heard the president make the case for this action as the action was already underway. He made very clear that the desire is multifold: one, to destroy the Iranian military, and separately to get rid of the nuclear program, and finally to topple the Iranian regime. Can you give us a better understanding of what a challenge this is, the president's desire that he just announced a short time ago?
Yeah, Peter. So I think of these targets in kind of three buckets. I think priority one bucket for the United States military working alongside Israel is the suppression of enemy air defenses, taking out missile launchers, taking out naval forces of the Iranian IRGC Navy, taking out Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and taking out command and control nodes. That's basically to prepare the battle space so that U.S. and Israeli jets and naval forces will have a much freer hand over Iranian skies. I think of the second priority set of targets, or bucket two, if you will, as nuclear targets. Targets that involve the production or the enrichment of nuclear fuel. Iran does not have a nuclear weapon right now. That's important to note. So there's no risk that we're going to be hitting a actual nuclear weapon, but they do have stores of places where they were conducting enrichment facilities. And I think also in this priority two bucket, I would say, are missile factories and ammunition dumps. And then the leadership targets, the regime targets, not just the ministries and the headquarters, but actually the homes and the hideouts and the bunkers of the leadership of Iran. And then priority three, I would say, are all of the regional proxies and nodes of the Iranian regime, to include forces in Yemen and forces in Iraq. So this is a very extensive targeting package that United States Central Command has had to develop. And our strategy, the United States' strategy, is really to do this through standoff weapons. We've been talking about no boots on the ground. That means we're going to be conducting these operations from air platforms and from naval platforms. As has been noted all week, Peter, we have 2 carrier strike groups in the Middle East right now. We've got the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group 12. We've got the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group 3. And those have F-35s. They've got F-18s. They've got electronic warfare aircraft. We've got the cruisers and destroyers and the submarines that accompanies those aircraft carriers. So we have a formidable military package arrayed at Iran. And the question really is Iran able to get off any of those missiles against U.S. forces in the region or against Israel?
Jeremy, as we heard from the president himself in his remarks a short time ago, he said, calling on the Iranian people to overthrow the government there in the days and weeks ahead. He said, it will be yours to take. He added, this will be probably your only chance for generations. Specific to that point about the president's desire for regime change in that region, you detailed both the Ford and Lincoln carrier strike groups in the region, the forces broadly throughout that region. What would it take? Can the U.S. succeed in its desire for regime change from a distance, or would that require there to be special forces or troops of any sort on the ground in that region, even though the president has made very clear that is not his desire?
It's hard to see how regime change can come about from airstrikes. And so you raised the most important point, Peter, which is what are the war objectives and how are we deploying military force to basically make those objectives more likely? I think our military force against Iran is really not even a fair fight. And we don't want it to be a fair fight, by the way. So I think we have a asymmetric advantage over Iran. Yes, they can hit our forces, and I think the president said correctly tonight that there could be U.S. casualties. But I think we're going to have such strategic overmatch over Iran. And we can take out the regime. And I think really that's not a hard task. What's going to be hard is what comes behind it. What happens on the streets of Tehran, the streets of the major cities in Iran? Do the people actually rise up and take power? Will there be an organization of that power? Will there be internecine civil war activity? Will regime elements go after people trying to march on the capital? We saw that in Libya in the 2000s, and that's where the United States had to intervene to take out Gaddafi and to take out some of the Libyan forces that were going after the people as they rose up. So this is a very uncertain task. How are we going to effectuate a credible, sustainable, long-term, peaceful regime change, a change in the regime with air power alone? I don't think anyone has exactly laid that out. I think that's going to be the challenge of the administration in the coming days and weeks, is to make clear to the American people, to our allies and partners and people around the region, is what is our ultimate strategy? What's the end game? And how do we know when we've won?
Jeremy Bash is one of our national security experts who's joining us at this early hour. Jeremy, we're going to ask you to stay with us right now. To Jeremy's point, this is not the first U.S. operation in Iran, and certainly not the first that's taken place overseas since President Trump took office. You can count attacks on Syria, Iraq, Iran, Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, Venezuela, the Caribbean as well. But this one appears most likely to be the most sustained, as evidenced by the president's remarks a short time ago in a post on his preferred megaphone social media, Truth Social. NBC's Julie Sirkin, one of our correspondents covering the White House for us, is in West Palm Beach this morning. Julie, we saw the president post those remarks, about 8 minutes in total. If you watched it, you could see that there were slight edits in it, clearly something that was pre-recorded before it was posted, as the president made the case for war, saying, among other things, that the U.S. may have casualties. In his words, that often happens in war. Can you give us a better understanding about what we heard from the president in the waning hours before this strike began, and what, if anything, we know about the president's plans over the course of the next 24 hours?
Well, there are so many interesting statements, Peter, that the president had said, but 3 points stood out to me, and I want to just re-up those for our viewers. Of course, this video was posted several hours ago. I will note that he appeared to be wearing the same USA hat that he was wearing when he deplaned at Palm Beach International Airport last night, as we're trying to read the tea leaves of when potentially this video was put together and filmed. 3 main things that I just want to highlight. He said that this is going to be a massive and ongoing operation. Our reporting, of course, backs that that up, that these strikes are going to be sustained. This is not one and done. This is not something more limited that we were thinking the president might take, a direction he might take, as these talks, peace talks, have been ongoing between his deputies, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, the vice president, J.D. Vance, meeting with Omani counterparts just yesterday. President Trump, hours before that video message was put out, telling reporters as he left a political event in Texas that he is not happy with the direction of these talks. He again suggested that the Iranian government in Tehran needs to accept the U.S.'s terms, need to abandon their nuclear program. And of course, from the president's video, we see that they have not. And he warned of American casualties. I think that was so notable, especially coming from a president that campaigned on not starting new wars. His base, we know, has been concerned about the idea of American involvement. The president had said that there won't be boots on the ground, but certainly in an operation like this, he said today that despite his best efforts, he does believe that there could be potential casualties. We know the president takes that to mean both injured and dead. And of course, the president as well told the Iranian people, the protesters there that we saw rise up in the streets a couple of weeks ago, the same protesters that the president had said help is on the way for. Now the president suggesting this is their only chance to now take this opportunity, essentially putting this on them and pursue possible regime change, which we know some of the allies in the president's ears that you heard Kristen talk about there, including Senator Lindsey Graham, have been trying to push him toward. I also, speaking of Graham, just want to note a piece of his statement in which he said this operation has been well planned. It will be violent, extensive, Graham says, and I believe at the end of the day successful. That just goes to show you that some members of Congress, certainly ones that the president speaks to often, know some form and fashion that this operation is going to take place. I also have new reporting, Peter, in talking to sources in the last couple of minutes, that we know that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had called some individual members of the Gang of Eight. It comprises some of the most powerful key members of Congress in both parties that sit on the intelligence committees, that have access to this kind of information, members of leadership as well, that Rubio had placed those calls to them individually, warning them ahead of this operation taking place. And I'm also told, Peter, that key staff were notified while the operation was underway. This is notable and important because in prior operations, including the one that happened several weeks ago here in Palm Beach, Florida, with the capture of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, we know that lawmakers in that case were not given a heads up. And of course, there was a lot of frustration that branch having with the executive branch. And in this case as well, Peter, I should mention, we're already getting some early reaction and criticism as well to this operation. I know we'll talk about politics later, but this is notable because Congress, the Republican-led House, is going to take up a piece of legislation in the next couple of days, Peter, trying to limit the administration's power to take actions like this unilaterally without Congress's input. So all of this is going to quickly become a political issue for the president. But at this point, of course, these strikes, trying to monitor and figure out the extent of the damage, how long that they will take place for, and the extent as well of those peace talks that we knew just 24 hours ago were still taking place. What happens to those? We were monitoring a potential visit for Secretary of State Rubio to take to Israel early next week. What happens there? A lot of questions at this hour, Peter.
Yeah, Julie, you're wise to raise those questions right now, and the political backdrop to this is critical, obviously, given the fact that the U.S. is now at war with Iran. Many lawmakers, some of whom were notified, some of the top leaders notified as this operation was already underway, are certain to come out with real concerns about the president unilaterally, in effect, launching this war on Iran and whatever potential tentacles it has going forward throughout that region. I want to get back to NBC's chief foreign correspondent. That's Richard Engel. He is again with us right now from Tel Aviv. And Richard, obviously, there are a lot of moving parts all happening at one time right now. First, of course, was what instigated all of this, the U.S. and Israeli strikes taking place in Iran. Now we're hearing about some of the response. Iran with some public comments right now, and also we're hearing about an American consulate, some explosions near an American consulate in Iraq. Is that right?
So even while we've been on air, this has continued to escalate. So we talked about all the different countries that have been attacked by Iran so far. Just in the last few moments, the French news agency AFP is reporting explosions near the U.S. consulate in Erbil. Reuters reporting another wave of attacks against installations, U.S. military installations in Qatar. An Iranian official, a senior Iranian official, the head of the National Security Commission, and I'm quoting, he said that a regional war has now started. And Israeli media, quoting Israeli officials, say that so far 35 ballistic missiles have been fired at Israel just today, just since Israel and the United States began these preemptive strikes. We've also been able to get in touch with a few people in Iran. There is a lot of confusion, a lot of concern, a lot of panic in the city right now. There is a great deal of traffic. The government is issuing guidance telling people that they should, if they can, get out of Tehran.
Richard Engel on the ground for us in Tel Aviv, Israel right now. Richard, as you stay with us, I want to ask you one quick question. Again, we're approaching 6 o'clock. At the top of the hour, we will reset for those who are just waking up with us, give you the very latest on what we're witnessing happening right now. Richard, as we were reporting a short time ago, two U.S. officials tell NBC News that there were multiple targets in the course of this effort in Iran this morning, that the Israeli targets focused on Iranian leadership, the U.S. targets focused on both the Iranian ballistic missile and nuclear programs there. As we focus on those multiple targets, this is so much broader in terms of its scope than what we saw last year in Midnight Hammer, isn't it? The president making clear that his desire is that this ultimately does lead to the toppling of the Iranian regime, the Ayatollah himself.
This is of a completely different scale than what we saw this summer with Operation Midnight Hammer. Operation Midnight Hammer was an Israeli-initiated war that the United States joined in. The United States had a very limited involvement in its military strikes. It hit the nuclear facilities primarily because it was only the United States that had the capacity to penetrate deep into the mountains using its very powerful bunker-busting technology to attack the uranium enrichment sites and to set back, if not destroy, Iran's nuclear program. This time, however, both Israel and President Trump have said the goal is regime change, that they want to weaken the government of Iran to a point that the people are able to take matters into their own hands and overthrow the government, continue the uprising that took place in every Iranian province only a few short weeks ago, an uprising that the Iranian government was able to suppress by killing thousands of demonstrators, according to multiple human rights groups. This is a far more ambitious, a far more open-ended mission than what we saw in the summer, because carrying out regime change, there's only a few ways you can do it. You can either go, like the United States did in Iraq, with troops, bringing a group of new leaders with you. It's the same thing that the United States did in Afghanistan after 9/11, and occupy the country and try and manage the transition. That's one way. Or you can, which seems to be the strategy now, weaken the regime to the point where the people take matters into their own hands and overthrow the government. But Iran is a country that is covered in mountains. It has about 90 million people. It has many different groups. Several different religious sects. The security forces there are quite strong. So you could not necessarily just see regime change. You could see state collapse and Iran breaking up into several different sections. The last way that a regime change could happen is there could be a military coup where you have so much pressure on the military that certain officers decide that Iran is now engaged in a fight that it cannot win and takes over the regime. But all of these are possibilities, but I think it seems that the U.S. at this stage, because it's not sending a ground force, is hoping for the second, that someone within the Iranian regime will take over, someone that could be potentially more moderate or more amenable to working with the United States, a la what happened in Venezuela, or that there'll be a street revolution with, frankly, unknown consequences.
All of this getting underway on February 28th, the final day of February 2026. Our colleague Richard Engel on the ground in Tel Aviv.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app, or watch live on our YouTube channel.